Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to our Gaza lecture series. Next week, we have our final lecture on Gaza. And then that will be it for this semester. We're hoping to pick up the lecture series in the new semester where we have a robust series of speakers coming through. Go to our website to find out more information. I also want to announce that this Thursday, our center, the center that I direct, the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, is doing a special event on Zohran Mamdani and the future of American politics. We're bringing Eric Latch from the New Yorker to talk about his reporting on the ground in New York. And so that's happening Thursday at noon. You can find more information about that on our website as well. Today, we turn our attention to the topic of Gaza and the politics of anti-Semitism with Lara Friedman, who I'll introduce in a moment. We're going to have a conversation, then we're going to open it up to Q&A. The importance of this topic is self-evident. In recent years, we have seen a rise in anti-Semitism around the world and in this country. This has included several high-profile attacks on Jewish targets, such as the 2018 shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 2019 Jersey City shooting at a kosher grocery store in New Jersey, the more recent shooting here in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol Jewish Museum, an attack in Boulder, Colorado, against Jewish protesters, and many other similar incidents. Events since October the 7th, 2023 in Gaza have generated more incidents of anti-Semitism globally and here in the United States. The reliable statistics and data clearly bear this out. At the same time, we've also seen, as we've noticed recently in the context of the New York City mayoral election, the instrumentalization and the politicization of charges of anti-Semitism to attack politicians, in this case, Zohran Mamdani. Members of the US Congress and the President of the United States are also guilty of this charge. In the context of Israeli policy in Gaza, the Netanyahu government has repeatedly used the charge of anti-Semitism to shield itself from criticism of charges that the state of Israel is guilty of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in Gaza. Recall Netanyahu's response when the International Criminal Court indicted him for war crimes. He famously said that the prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, was, quote, one of the worst anti-Semites in human history. And then, of course, we have the Trump administration and the crackdown on American universities that have been launched in the name of combating anti-Semitism on campuses in this country. Universities and colleges that don't comply with the demands of the US government have been punished financially. And presidents of numerous colleges and universities, including Georgetown, have appeared before a congressional hearing on anti-Semitism in higher education. How can we make sense of this topic ethically, politically, historically? Where does legitimate criticism of Israel end? Where does anti-Semitism begin? How is rising anti-Semitism connected to events in Gaza? To what extent are the policies of the Netanyahu government in Israel fueling anti-Semitism? How can we both fight the scourge of anti-Jewish bigotry while simultaneously supporting the human and national rights of the Palestinian people? To help us understand this topic today, it's an honor to host Lara Friedman she's the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace here in Washington, D.C. She's an expert in U.S. foreign policy in the region, the Israel-Palestine conflict in particular, with a special expertise in the way the Israel-Palestine conflict and related issues play out in Congress, in U.S. domestic politics, policies, and legislation. Lara is also a preeminent subject matter expert in the area of anti-Palestinian legislation and lawfare, including the weaponization and instrumentalization of anti-Semitism in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Her research on lawfare and anti-Semitism related topics is widely cited and recognized as authoritative in this area, hence her invitation. She's a former officer in the U.S. Foreign Service in the U.S. State Department with diplomatic postings in Jerusalem, Washington, Tunis, and Beirut. And she's also served previously as the Director of Policy and Government Relations at Americans for Peace Now. She's a graduate of the University of Arizona and also a graduate of the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. Laura, welcome back to Georgetown.
Thank you.
It's an understatement to say this, but I wish we were meeting under better circumstances given what's happening in Gaza. I want to begin with sort of a broad question. Take your time to answer it. And in many ways, it's sort of the most important question. Where does legitimate criticism of the policies of the state of Israel end, and when does it cross over into anti-Semitism? How can we think about this issue that is in many ways foundational for debates here on campuses and in the American public at large?
Great. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming. Folks online, thanks for being online. And I thank you for starting me off with a super simple and easy question. So I'll answer it in one sentence and we can move on. So first I should say, I mean, I'm a practitioner. I'm not an academic. I don't have a PhD in any of the areas of study that would apply to this. I've come into being someone who talks about anti-Semitism a lot, really inadvertently, because of the work I do on Israel-Palestine. For those of us who follow what happens with US policy, with Congress, in 2016, the State Department adopted a new definition of anti-Semitism, which at that time was called the Working Definition of Antisemitism. That became what we'll talk about in a minute, the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of antisemitism. And at the time, I remember talking to a friend of mine at another organization who said, hey, we should pay attention to this because this is going to be laying the groundwork for fundamentally shutting down everything we're all doing and saying in support of Palestinian lives and Palestinian rights. That's 2016, right? That's long before we are now. And that sort of was the beginning of an odyssey. I think for a lot of people who are coming to the realization now that this debate around what is and isn't anti-Semitism is sort of become like a crux of the arguments around Gaza, around free speech, around academia, need to understand that this is a long time coming, right? And it isn't haphazard that it happened. The idea that there is this thing called anti-Semitism, which I think any person with any compassion and understanding of history and morality would say, wow, hatred, bigotry, threats, violence against people because of their religion. And the Jewish people have had this experience across generations. That is absolutely unacceptable and we have to stand up to it and fight it. That's a pretty uncontroversial thing to say. But shifting to then expanding what it means, okay, we've all agreed this thing, we're going to call it anti-Semitism, it's terrible, must be fought. And now we're going to expand that definition to also include criticism of a certain area of political thought, and we've used that to shut it down. That's when we start using words like weaponization. And where we are today is with this debate kind of taking center stage is the culmination of what has been an effort which has been going on for many, many years, even before this definition. For those of us who grew up in Jewish households, and I remember my grandparents, if somebody was very critical of Israel, my grandfather would fire off a letter to the editor and say this is anti-Semitic very quickly. So this doesn't come from nowhere. At this moment in time, I mean, maybe it's very positive that we're all focusing on it. So trying to find what is the distinction between anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism of Israel. I think, there are people who want to say it's a gut check. You just know, which is, by the way, why you'll be told that if you're not Jewish, you can't tell me. When you say, you're not Jewish, you can't say what Israel is an anti-Semitism. Only a Jewish person can tell you. And if a Jewish person says it isn't anti-Semitism, then we're the wrong kind of people. Right? This is what Mr. Greenblatt from the Anti-Defamation League said about the mayor-elect in New York. He was talking to the wrong kind of Jews because they supported him. The bottom line is I don't think you're going to get a satisfactory answer from someone like me. I think you need to actually look to people who look at hatred and discrimination across all areas and do not focus only on the Jewish history and Jewish experience. There is a distinction between opposing political thought and hating people because of who they are. The problem that we're facing today is that those who have claimed the mantle of being the leadership on this question, after generations, decades of saying, well, one of the ways we know what is anti-Semitic is if you are conflating Jews with Israel. I grew up with this and I believe this. If you decide you want to come to my house and picket my house because I have a mezuzah on my door, I'm going to say you're an anti-Semite. You don't know me. You don't know my political views. You know nothing about me. All you know is that I'm Jewish, so you hate me. That's not fair. If I have an Israeli flag in my window and you're out in front, I will say, okay, maybe you're coming here because you dislike my political views and have a conversation. And the ADL for years stood firm with that distinction. Conflating Jews and Israel is anti-Semitism. For those of us who work on Palestine activism, you've probably heard the times when Palestinians living in Palestine often refer to the Israelis as Jews, which is, there's a distinction without a difference on the ground, right? And Israelis refer to Jews and Arabs. That's the terminology they use. But you will see these gotchas in the media for years where they'll say, these people in Gaza, when they were complaining ostensibly about the IDF, they said the Jews, therefore they're anti-Semites. Because we all agree you can't conflate the two. Except in the current era, and it starts before October 7th. I go back to things like, Barry Weiss's The New Antisemitism book. They're simultaneously saying it's anti-Semitic to conflate Israel and the Jews, and it's anti-Semitic to not conflate them, right? So really you lose either way. If you don't conflate them, then you are discriminating against Jews because support for Israel is intrinsic to Jewish identity. Except you've been telling me for years it's not intrinsic to Jews. You've been telling me for years you can't conflate. So trying to disaggregate this stuff requires, I think, a very honest understanding both of the political motivations here. There's a clear political motivation behind, say, any meaningful criticism of Israel, because that's what it really comes down to. They say you're allowed to criticize Israel, but only if you follow these rules. I'm sorry, I am someone who's focused on Israel-Palestine. That's my work. I am not focused on, for instance, every instance of genocide around the world. That's not what I do. They will say, well, that means you're an anti-Semite because you're only focusing on Israel and what they're doing on Gaza. I reject that. I've used for years the analogy of someone who is, an advocate for only one, a family member of mine died of this particular disease. So I work around the world to raise awareness and raise money for this one disease. Does that mean I don't care about any other disease? No, it means that this one has a personal connection for me. But essentially trying to disaggregate these political motivations behind the conflation with what is a genuinely complicated identity issue for Jewish Americans and Jews around the world who have for generations been, I think, legitimately because of religious belief and because of education been inculcated to believe that support for Israel is part of their identity. And trying to disaggregate those into an honest conversation about what you can and can't say is not an easy thing. And it's what right now that difficulty is being very effectively weaponized in the current debate.
Let me tell you how I, in my own mind, determine where the red line is, where criticism of Israel crosses over to anti-Semitism. When you criticize Israel, you're criticizing the policies of the government and of politicians. The line gets crossed over into anti-Semitism when you start using the language of an entire group of people based on their ethnicity or religion. That's when it veers into something very toxic and, objectionable.
So I would agree with that. I think it gets more difficult when you have the legacy Jewish leadership in this country and other countries essentially saying, no, that's not it. Because by the way, all Jews feel this way.
Right.
And the Jews who don't, they're un-Jews. They're Jews in name only. I've been called a Gino on social media, Jew in name only. They're the as a Jews. It's like the idea effectively is to invisibilize those Jews who disagree and to effectively say, no, all Jewish people are represented by this political view. So for me to draw that line, I've watched, there's been a really interesting debate that is building now in social media amongst Palestine activists about whether it is legitimate to keep demanding that they draw that line. I hope they do. I think it is very it's very worrisome if we get into language which says the Jews this and the Jews that, because I do think that sure feels anti-Semitic to me, whether it's intended that way or not. But I understand their response, which is, well, Jonathan Greenblatt doesn't make the distinction. Why would we? And if we poll Jewish Americans and this percentage say we agree that Zionism is part of our religion effectively, and if we poll Jewish Israelis and they overwhelmingly support genocide, why should we make that distinction? I will say, as someone who's active in this space, I really hope you do keep making that distinction, but I understand the argument.
Yeah. Can we get into some of these definitions of anti-Semitism that are very much part of this public debate? You know, growing up, you know, most people knew what anti-Semitism was. It suggested or implied or was about discriminating against Jews because they're Jewish. Then, you know, relatively recently, we have this IRA definition that emerges, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, that is sort of the official position of many American Jewish organizations and the US government now. And some universities have adopted this. Then there was the Jerusalem Declaration, which came in response to the IRA definition. Could you give us a sense of the politics surrounding these different definitions and how can we navigate this terrain?
Sure, and there's also the nexus definition.
The nexus
And there's also the Biden definition, which people forget about. So I would actually say that historically, I think what most of us understood as a Jewish person to be anti-Semitism it's not merely discrimination. It's hatred, it's bigotry, it's violence, it's threats of violence. It's people saying things when you're in class that suggest that they hold views about Jewish people that are deeply offensive and that echo tropes that our grandparents lived with about money and about power and about evil, and that all of us experienced to some extent growing up, and we're very, very, very sensitive to for good reason. This is something that's passed on like Holocaust memory, frankly, as part of Jewish identity. That is anti-Semitism. But then there's this politicization, which again, it predates October 7th, it predates Barry Weiss. It goes back to our grandparents and really back to the birth of Israel and criticism of Israel. It's worth reminding people, and for folks who haven't studied Zionism, that Jewish Americans were not, a lot of Jewish Americans weren't eager Zionists. There was a real concern that Zionism was going to be a problem for Jewish Americans and their place in American society and assimilation. It really wasn't until after 1967 that you had Jewish American organizations really jump on board full throttle as Zionists. But even then, the question of politicizing the definition, I don't think really gained steam until there was something to not want people to be talking about for real. Because let's remember, in the early days, it was easy in the United States. You mentioned the word Palestinians and people said terrorists, right? It was easy. I mean, it was horrible and it reflected a whole different kind of discrimination. But there wasn't this sense of like, oh God, we're losing the argument. The real, in my experience as someone who's researched this and in my own lived experience, the real debate around the real effort around trying to politicize anti-Semitism started as we had a peace process. And suddenly you had a need to discredit the Palestinians, to discredit the normalization of Palestine as a word or Palestinians as a word, and to really try it's a power play. And we really saw that. I mean, I grew up with this, you know, when I was in college and, you know, going into the Oslo period and, you know, Arafat's an anti-Semite and all that. He's a Nazi. It was very clear. As we've escalated and Israeli behavior, and this is my analysis, with the era of the peace process, there was a sense of opening up for debate and discussion that was allowed in part because Israel really was cast as a good player, right? Trying to make peace or coming to the table. As that eroded, and in certainly the lifetime of most of you in this room, that has not been the position of the Israeli government. The Israeli government has used the pretense of wanting peace to expand and cement occupation and apartheid. That is the experience of the past 20 years for sure. During that period, it's gotten harder and harder to defend Israel in the public square. And if you can't defend it, the best defense is a good offense. And you go on offense against people criticizing, including the Jewish people criticizing, including the Israeli people criticizing. And as the BDS movement has gained credibility, largely because of the bad behavior of Israel, you end up in a situation where the most effective, if not the only tool left, really, has been to discredit. And the anti-Semitism argument, in my experience, that's where it really has gained the energy. A Jewish American who is just struggling, saying, I really love Israel, I hate Bibi, and I don't know how to make the argument in defense of Israel. And someone comes along and says, you don't need to make the argument. They're anti-Semites. You don't need to make the argument on why boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the three tools which are the gold standard for nonviolent protest around the world, which by the way, Jewish Americans have rallied around when it comes to South Africa or wherever else. We can't come up with really good substantive arguments for why you shouldn't allow these tools to be used here. We'll call them anti-Semitic and it's over. And it's very effective. And you have, the 3 Ds of delegitimization coming out of Israel. And this really just takes on a life of its own. The IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and at some point, you should have Ken Stern here at some point to see. Ken Stern was the American Jewish Committee expert on anti-Semitism, who was the lead drafter on this definition. It was a definition that was developed as an academic, as an academic tool to trace the way that anti-Semitism was changing over time and evolving in Europe. That's what it was supposed to be. It was never meant to be a definition to put into law and to enforce. So this definition eventually takes off. They add on a bunch of examples, all of which conflate criticism or anti-Semitism, and then it becomes this weapon unto itself. And there's ever since then been an international campaign to get it adopted. In response, this goes back a few years, people started to realize this was going to be this is becoming a real problem. So you had the JDA, this is the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which came out of a very high-level project of scholars in Jerusalem. You had something called Nexus, that came out of the project at UCLA. Both of those were trying to find a different way to affirmatively define anti-Semitism, and in so doing, push back against IRA. I would say analytically, there are positives in each of them. The fundamental negative in each of them is that there's still Israel and the Palestinians are still fundamental to the definition of anti-Semitism, which it isn't. I mean, that's the whole. I think a lot of Palestinians have been have rightfully pushed back against both. Anti-Semitism is not about Palestinians, and it's not about Israel. It's not about Palestinian rights. And when you're trying to defensively push back by still buying into that paradigm, you're in some ways still doing harm. I will say that President Biden, when he announced his anti-Semitism strategy, he mentioned IRA and he mentioned Nexus, but more important, he offered his own definition of anti-Semitism. He actually articulated a clear definition of anti-Semitism, which really boils down to anti-Semitism is hatred, discrimination, bigotry, threats, and violence against Jews because they're Jews. That is what's in there, and which has been largely ignored because it doesn't serve anybody's political purposes. Sorry, I give really long answers.
No, thank you. Let me move to something that's more contemporary that they recognize. So after October the 7th, 2 slogans were widely used in the public solidarity movements for the people of Gaza that were considered to be inherently and enduringly anti-Semitic. From the river to the sea and globalize the Intifada. The New York mayoral race was sort of partly about this because, Mamdani was criticized for not condemning the term globalize the Intifada, even though he said that he never uses it, but he was condemned for not using it, and thus, he was charged with anti-Semitism. On these 2 particular slogans in terms, how do you understand them and how do you interpret them? Because the mainstream establishment view, the congressional view, Congress women have been censured because they've used the term from the river to the sea. And Mamdani and others have been condemned for using the term globalize the Intifada. How do you respond to the claim that these terms are anti-Semitic?
I mean, the bottom line for me is that these are red herrings. These are efforts to dictate to Palestine activists what language they use and to make it a debate around the language they use and not what Israel is doing on the ground. And it worked incredibly well. Let's spend all of our energy debating the exact text. By the way, there are Jewish activists who on the ground are saying the equivalent of river to the sea every day. We have settlers. I mean, this is their slogan, this is their goal, and it's not considered any problem at all. But the parsing of the language, I think has been done to death. I don't personally find either slogan to be anti-Semitic. By the way, there may be people using these slogans who are anti-Semites. There's anti-Semites all over the place, and there are anti-Muslim bigots and anti-Palestinian bigots all over the place. That doesn't mean the slogans themselves are problematic. And either way, fundamentally, and we've seen this since the beginning of Palestine activism, it is much easier to to force people to have a debate around the language they're using than to have a debate around what they are protesting. And that's not just with respect to Palestine, but it's been so clear for these past 2 years. We're not going to talk about the fact that Israel for 2 years has been carrying out genocide on the ground. We're going to debate whether or not by using the word genocide, you're an anti-Semite. I said, I tweeted out or posted on X, whatever, 2 years ago, if I stopped using the word genocide, will you do everything you can to stop it? I didn't think so. I mean, it's just so much easier. The fundamental, arguments here are not about the language. In terms of language, globalized intifada, I am sure there are people out there using that language who I disagree. If they were to really dig down on what they mean, then I disagree with them and I find what they're saying really, really worrying. It has to do with violence. It has to do with overthrowing rules of order, whatever. I think most people using this are using it to intifada to mean rising up and fighting what is wrong. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the first intifada. Fundamentally, intifada is about challenging the paradigms in which we live that are wrong. And I believe people when they say that's what they mean. I believe people when they say river to the sea, Palestine will be free. There are some people who I have no doubt mean something that is not something I'm comfortable with in terms of where they see the future of people who are not Palestinian on the ground. And we can debate that. That's a fair thing to debate. But I think there's equal number of people or more who mean free for everybody. And if the idea is a Palestine river to the sea where everybody has equal rights as human beings, that you find that anti-Semitic, then there's a real problem with your idea of what anti-Semitism means. Because I don't think it's intrinsic to my nature as a Jew that I oppose equal rights for people anywhere. And I'm deeply offended that you would.
Yeah, this came up in the New York mayoral race when Mamdani was constantly attacked by Cuomo for not willing to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. And he kept coming back and saying, I recognize Israel has the right to exist, but as a state where all of its citizens are equal. And so the argument, which is sort of, so shocking, is that to call for equal rights between Israelis and Palestinians from the river to the sea is interpreted by some people as an act of anti-Semitism.
Well, and what's particularly, galling, I think, for me as a Jewish American here is very different than in Jewish Israeli existence. Part of Jewish American identity, or at least Jewish American non-Orthodox identity, is this idea of Israel light unto the nations as a liberal democracy. I mean, I was raised, part of the talking points I learned growing up in defending Israel is that is a liberal democracy where there are equal rights for people, Jewish and non-Jewish. There are equal rights under law, and that, yes, it's not perfect, but there's this judiciary that's independent, and no democracy is perfect, which is true. I mean, that was fundamental. The language about Israel being a Jewish state and having that be that, I followed this in real time, and in the early aughts with Bibi Netanyahu, and there was this argument that it wasn't sufficient for years, for decades. The demand on the PLO and the Palestinians was you must recognize the existence of Israel. You must recognize Israel. Then it was you must recognize Israel's right to exist, which is a much bigger ask. It's one thing to say, I recognize that you do exist and you're going to exist and I'll make peace with you if we have to. But now you say, you have to recognize our right to exist, which suggests sort of God-given right. And then it changed to, and this was, I think, during the end of the Clinton era, maybe a little bit later, you have to recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, which has been a red line. Because if you recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, then part of your recognition is to take away the rights of Palestinians. You take away the rights of the Palestinians who still live there, to live in equality, and you're also taking away the rights of Palestinians who were thrown out. I mean, it's essentially erasing the Nakba. And you can have every argument you want about Israel's creation in 48 and who did what, when, and we're having more honest discussions about that now than we ever have before. But if in order to be considered not anti-Semitic, you have to effectively agree that the Nakba didn't happen, or that the people who lost their homes and lives in the Nakba should never have been there in the first place. They had no rights to it because it's a Jewish state that has a right to exist. It's a deeply problematic formula. I think Mamdani handled it very well, and he handled it in a way, that kind of language where you push back on equality, which creates something of a connection for at least for Jewish American progressives who still in their hearts believe this what is now kind of, I would say Hasbara framing, but framing which is And you put something on a pedestal and you look at it as you wish it was, not how it is, which insists that Israel is a democracy with equal rights and equal respect. He's really challenging that. He's challenging people to see things as they are.
So one of the related arguments that you touched upon that has to do with accusations of anti-Semitism is disproportionately focusing on the policies of the state of Israel as opposed to other countries. So watching the mayoral race, I didn't search for this, I just accidentally came across a video from Alan Dershowitz, who was attacking Mamdani, saying, why is he focusing on Israel's claim to be a Jewish state and laws with respect to equality between Israelis and Palestinians, but not other countries in the region. You know, I always say there's that he's obviously discriminating, and that's evidence of his anti-Semitism. And then he actually said something even more bizarre. He said, well, look at England. He doesn't criticize England. There's an established church there, and it's an Anglican state. And I haven't heard Mamdani criticize that. So this idea of double standards and focusing exclusively on Israel is central to this debate on not only anti-Semitism, but it's part of the IRA definition, that if you sort of focus on Israel to the exclusion of other countries, that sort of is an indication that there's something toxic here in terms of your political ethics. How do you respond to that argument?
There's a couple of pieces. I mean, for the Mamdani election, I think there's something that anyone who watched this election, and there's something kind of hilarious about it, because there's only really one non-US issue, which was he was asked about constantly.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty sure that I don't know Zoran Mamdani, but I'm pretty sure he would have preferred to not spend whatever percentage of his campaign talking about Israel. He's very focused on New York.
Yeah.
And his answer, you know, like when he was asked what's the first foreign country he'll travel to, the answer is supposed to be Israel. His answer is, I'm not going to travel to a foreign country. I'm going to work on New York.
Yeah.
There's something kind of hilarious about people now denouncing his disproportionate focus on Israel when they're the ones who focus disproportionately on Israel and forced him to constantly respond on this. But you know, the bigger question, you know, there's a whataboutism, right? And this is again, this is not new. This is something we've always had. I used to joke when I was when I go and argue with someone about, you know, on Capitol Hill or something about something Israel is doing, and they'd say, well, you know, and they'd mention they'd say, you know, Russia's worse or China's worse or, you know, Saudi Arabia is worse, whatever it is. And I'd say, if your only defense for what I've just raised, you're not saying Israel didn't do it. You're saying it's not that. You're saying it's not that bad. You're just saying someone here who's not democratic, not liberal, doesn't have the kind of rule of law. You're saying that they're worse. I've already won this argument, right? If the only answer you've got is to say there are worse actors in the world, and I was wrong, because that apparently the winning argument is, yes, if you're not holding Israel to the lowest standard that we can locate anywhere in the world, then you're an anti-Semite and we don't have to listen to you. So maybe it's true that Israel's doing this. And I mean, these are arguments we had, you know, there's a question of Israel and this came up around Jerusalem. It was a debate going on. I won't mention the person the debate was with, around Palestinians in Jerusalem who do not have the right to vote in national elections. They do not have rights. They have privileges that they enjoy, and Israel can take away at any time as residents of their homes that they've been in for hundreds of years, all of that. And this is being brought up as an example of Israel's non-democratic nature. And this person basically brought up all the examples of places in the world where people live in a place and don't have a right to vote, including their cases that are indefensible in with US territories. And again, we're going to bring up the worst cases. And they actually brought up Washington, DC, which was kind of funny. Puerto Rico. And the answer is, I can't defend what they're doing, but there's somebody worse. And if you're not focusing on the worst, then that means that you're an anti-Semite. This is intrinsic to the IRA definition, which basically says you can't criticize Israel unless it's the same kind of criticism you give for anybody else,
Right.
which we call the all lives mattering of criticism of Israel, which is, again, there's something kind of hilarious about this. There is, I mean, an entire ecosystem of organizations that exist to do nothing but defend and promote Israel. But organizations that exist to defend and promote Palestinian rights, that means ipso facto, you're anti-Semitic, right? By definition. These are logical fallacies and red herrings. And again, the purpose of all of these, like the debate around River to the Sea, is to keep you from focusing on what you're protesting.
Mhm.
I don't want the world to focus on the fact that Israel is holding a 16-year-old American citizen in detention now since February without charges. He's lost whatever massive percentage of his body weight. He has scabies, and now they're about to essentially summarily put him in jail for 2 years. I don't want to talk about that because that's indefensible.
Mhm.
He's been held since February without charges in the most horrific conditions. It's easier to say, why are you focusing on Israel? There are other countries that hold children. Focus on that instead. And if you won't focus on it, every country in the world that has bad behavior here, that can only mean you're an anti-Semite. It can't mean that you have a particular connection on Palestine. It can't mean that you feel a particular responsibility because you're American and our tax dollars enable this. And our political view, our political positions at the UN defend it and protect it. And our weapons are what makes it possible. I mean, you can't, none of those are good enough reasons. It can only be that you're anti-Semitic. This is a weaponization, again, of the basic concept of anti-Semitism to quash any meaningful criticism, any meaningful examination. And it's not acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, the best response, you just sort of articulated it, is that we're not, the United States, our tax dollars are not directly going to support and perpetuate a genocide in Sudan. We are in the case of Gaza.
Yes.
Our ally, the Emirates, are sort of, guilty of that. So there's some moral responsibility there, but the cases are very different. It just serves elementary sort of logic, moral logic, and suggests that you're more responsible for things that your tax dollars are supporting as opposed to things that you're not
And
supporting.
not just for tax dollars. I mean, again, the US veto at the UN. We've lived through 2 years of vetoes of ceasefire resolutions. I feel some responsibility for that as an American.
Yeah. Let me, I'm going to ask you for more questions and I'll open it up to the audience. So there's a new report that's been published that sort of is very central to campus politics and accusations of anti-Semitism that's been compiled by the Middle East Studies Association and the American Association of University Professors. Relying on publicly available records, they've offered recently in this report a detailed account of how landmark civil rights legislation, particularly the Title VI legislation that goes back to 1964, the Civil Rights Act, has become a primary tool to restrict free speech on American university colleges and university campuses. And the report says, and I'm summarizing, I'm quoting from the Guardian summary of this report. According to the report, only 1 out of the 102 anti-Semitism complaints that the authors reviewed raises anti-Semitism claims unrelated to criticism of Israel. And so all of the claims with respect to this particular topic on university campuses that allege anti-Semitism revolve around the Israel-Palestine conflict. You've done research in this area that you says actually goes much beyond this particular report. Could you comment on the claims of this report and how we can sort of understand it?
Sure. The fun thing about this report, and when I say that I've done my own research, I maintain databases. I am an obsessive. I'm like a pack rat with data. Like I gather it and I organize it, put it into tables, and then I put it out for the public and I update it constantly because I figure, if everybody knows what I know, we can have at least a clearer debate. And I've been following the battle around anti-Semitism in academia for years. I've got a massive database online, which you can find on our website, which Nader can talk about. So please feel free. But what's fun about this data is it's public. I mean, they base it on the Department of Education reports. These are online. I'm not positive it's online with the government shutdown and the Trump administration has taken a lot of stuff offline. Title VI complaints it's limited what you can get until they're made public. So someone can file a complaint, but until a decision has been made and then something's posted online, it's hard to see everything. So we're not seeing everything. We're only seeing the stuff that's actually been posted. But since before October 7th, people have been filing Title VI discrimination complaints on campus claiming anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them clearly are. I mean, there's cases of people being attacked because they're wearing a kippah or, coming out of a Hillel. There's absolutely anti-Semitism. It exists everywhere. And it absolutely not acceptable. Post October 7th, what we saw was an explosion of Title VI complaints. Bad word. We saw a whole proliferation of another bad word. There's no good words to use for a whole lot of them coming out of these Title VI complaints on campus. Most of them are filed by people who are not on campus. Most of them are filed by people who have nothing to do with the actual complaint, which is really weird. In theory, that shouldn't be possible. Usually a Title VI complaint is going to be a student who's been affected or a parent or someone who's directly involved. What we had were armchair complaints where people are like reading an article about something that took place and they see a picture of a sign and they file a complaint. And next thing you know, there is an investigation open. And there were just loads of these. And I've got them all on my table. I think I don't know if they show their work in the annex, there's an annex report that has the actual complaints. But you can read through them and people will say, and the complaint is on this date, there was this event held and there were people shouting free Palestine and river to the sea and Jewish kids were afraid to walk nearby and this has to be stopped. I mean, literally, that's the kind of complaint. This started in 2024 or 2023. Biden administration took these complaints up and this really did gain energy under the Biden administration. The difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration, I will say, is that we had a functioning Department of Education. When these complaints came up, when there was a complaint that was going to be investigated, they actually did engage. They engaged as Title VI is supposed to work. They engaged with schools. They worked on, actually evaluating if something had happened. They, in many of these cases, combined them with cases of claims of anti-Palestinian racism and bigotry under Title VI, where you'd end up with a remediation that had to address both. They weren't used as cudgels. When there was an investigation, the result was not used generally as a cudgel against academia and the students. Trump administration came in and, as far as I can tell, basically said the existence of these claims is proof of anti-Semitism. Now we have this cudgel and we're going to use it against academia. And the wind beneath their wings still was the Biden administration, where we saw, for those of you who followed Congress, it was the Biden administration where we saw the series of hearings in Congress, Republican-led, but a lot of Democratic tolerance, if not outright support, for just crucifying academia, dragging presidents up there. And I'm going to say presidents and administrators of universities did a really bad job defending academia and defending their students. It's appalling. Where we are today is in large part because of the terrible job that academia, those in charge of it, did during the Biden era. But we are now in this period where it is now almost settled dogma, if not settled law, that all of academia is riven with anti-Semitism, that protest on campus is anti-Semitic, even it has nothing to do with Jewish identity. It's entirely about Israel. And the Trump administration has turned this into one of its most powerful weapons in the fight to shut down not just those who disagree with it, but those who in any way would empower and engage with ideas that would challenge the worldview of the people in power.
Yeah, okay, so last question and then we'll open up to the audience. And this is actually a personal moral dilemma that I have in terms of how does one both, fight for freedom of expression on campus so one can advocate for a just resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict, for Palestinian human rights, but at the same time, not fall into the trap of perpetuating dangerous anti-Jewish stereotypes. So to illustrate the point, I just want to draw everyone's attention to a very famous case that made international headlines a few years ago with Kenneth Roth and Harvard, the former executive director of Human Rights Watch. He had a fellowship at Harvard. All of a sudden, the fellowship is revoked from him because of pressure from pro-Israel donors on the dean. He raises stink about it. He exposes the scandal. And in the middle of exposing the scandal, the ADL CEO, Jonathan Greenblatt, sort of comments that, look, Ken, by raising the criticism that pro-Israel donors are behind the revocation of your fellowship, that's perpetuating a very dangerous anti-Semitic stereotype about Jews and power and manipulation. And so the moral dilemma that I see is sort of a double moral imperative. You want, on the one hand, to be able to have freedom of expression on campus, to advocate for causes that you believe in, and to call out those people who are pressuring your university administration officials to shut you down. You don't want to give up on that fight because it's important. But at the same time, you don't want to perpetuate a dangerous anti-Jewish stereotype that has very toxic historical connections. How do you balance those two competing moral imperatives?
Sorry, a couple of different answers. My first answer is, you call BS. I mean, it is legitimate to call out. I mean, when Ken Roth was effectively, targeted in that position,
Mhm.
I mean, he didn't say, the Jewish lobby is against me. I mean,
Right.
he didn't say anything like that. But the fact is that the biggest funders there, I mean, who are coming out and they're coming out as who they are. They're coming out calling him an anti-Semite. They're coming out saying, we will not allow him to be in this role. It isn't his fault they're Jewish. It's sort of like, Muhammad al-Kurd, sometimes says something about, it's not anti-Semitic to call it, we would be just as against the people taking our homes if they weren't Jewish. It's not our fault they're Jewish.
Mhm. Mhm.
If it's not Ken Roth's fault, the people who are trying to kick him out of his job happen to be Jewish.
Mhm.
And I think calling BS on that is important and doing so with confidence.
Mhm.
You're going to be more confident doing that, if you are very conscious of every word you're saying. And I think there's good reason that you should be very conscious of every word you're saying. This is fraught, and there are terrible, terrible anti-Semitic tropes out there.
Mhm.
At the same time, it is also realizing that you can get this letter perfect and still be yelled at.
Mhm.
Over the past 5 years, every so often I post something like, hey, look, another well-worn anti-Semitic trope that I've never heard of until today.
Mhm.
I say, this is a Jewish American raised in a Jewish family that's very sensitive to anti-Semitic tropes. It seems like periodically when someone wants to criticize, Rashida Tlaib or Francesca Albanese, I had no idea this was an anti-Semitic trope. It wasn't an anti-Semitic trope. The hundreds of times I've heard it before when it wasn't used by a critic of Israel to criticize Israel, but now it's an anti-Semitic trope. Fascinating. I mean, you will get this letter perfect and you're still going to get attacked.
Mhm.
So I think knowing exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it and knowing that you're not an anti-Semite and being able to make clear is absolutely critically important. The bottom line here is we have to be able to stand up. I say this we, because I hope everyone in this room is a person who will stand up and say, anti-Semitism is wrong. And I absolutely will not tolerate it. And if I hear it, I will stand up for it. You have to be able to walk and chew gum. I can simultaneously say that and mean it and hold that as something which is absolutely true. And say criticism of Israel for what it's doing and standing for Palestinian lives and rights
Mhm.
now when there's a genocide going on or ever is not anti-Semitism. If you can't hold those two things together, then you probably shouldn't be entering into this conversation because either you're an anti-Semite and I don't really want to engage you, or you're somebody who simply doesn't understand what you're doing here. We are dealing with genocide. If the answer is you can't talk about genocide because of anti-Semitism, then you have to be able to push back on that. If that's the answer you're getting.
Okay, very good. Thanks. I've got more questions, but this audience has been sitting patiently. I suspect there's people who have questions, and I saw a hand up in the back, so you're first. Go ahead.
Hi,
Nigar.
I'm not a student, but they're students. Thank you so much. Great to see you. I missed the very beginning, so if you talked about Zohran enough, just ignore this question. But I want to ask you what you see as the importance of Zohran Mamdani, not just for New York, but beyond New York. You're right. The mayor of New York doesn't have to work on US foreign policy towards the Middle East, but apparently that has become part of the job. And how dare you run for mayor of New York and have different views, but then at the same time, get the majority of the votes, including over 30% of the Jewish votes in New York. So what do you think is the importance of Yoram Mamdani as on him doubling down on this issue and being able to have all these volunteers and votes, including from the Jewish community? And also, mayor of New York City is, what do you call it, Tel Aviv of America. ADL has launched this monitor, Mamdani monitor. I don't know if they've ever done anything like that before. So if you can speak to all of this beyond just free buses and affordability in New York.
Sure.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about that, so
Yeah.
thank you for the
Okay.
question. I mean, look, Zohran Mamdani's campaign, even before his victory, is extraordinary. It speaks to a shift in certainly the body politic in New York, but I think more broadly. And if we used to live in a world where progressive accept on Palestine was acceptable, and where the most progressive candidates and members generally just didn't want to touch this issue, it was seen as radioactive, third rail. This suggests something has changed there.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people had speculated that was already the case going into this post, going post October 7th period, just because of the amount of protest and engagement that had, particularly with younger Americans, but not just younger Americans, If you go out to protest, you'll see a lot of older Americans too. It's very inspiring. That there had already been some tides turning. I suspect, frankly, that some of this is just there's an arc of history here. It's not for nothing that it was in the past 8 years or so that AIPAC finally, after years of saying, we're not a PAC, we're not a PAC, they launched formally a PAC and put millions and millions of dollars into making sure that more progressive candidates didn't win primaries. They never felt the need to do that before, right? That's already telling you that things are shifting. And going back to the anti-Semitic Trump thing, I think it's worth remembering that, you know, the whole Ilhan Omar getting in trouble for daring to suggest that money plays a role in the pro-Israel positions of politicians. I'm old enough to remember when that was the argument. And then we have AIPAC now in this very different role with its PAC. So I think the Mamdani's success, again, even if he hadn't won the primary, and the number of conversations I had with people who are like, I love him, he's amazing, he can't win, he'll never be allowed to win. That was the primary. And then when he won the primary, there was a sense that it was still going to somehow be taken from him. It was just not possible. And not only does he win, but he wins with this historic number. The numbers that came out are incredible. And for people who say, well, he won a bare majority, million, whatever. It's like, this is not a Democrat versus a Republican. This is a Democrat versus a Democrat running as an independent. It's an extraordinary result. And what it suggests and what we're seeing now, I say this as someone who follows every word that anyone in Congress says about Israel and Palestine, and increasingly I'm also following what candidates are saying going into the election period. I've never seen an election cycle where every day there's another candidate or incumbent coming out and saying, I'm not taking AIPAC money. It's amazing, including someone like Seth Moulton, who was not actually very progressive on this stuff, but who clearly has recognized that, you know, this has become, you know, it's more trouble than it's worth politically for him to associate with AIPAC. And that's not just AIPAC. AIPAC, I think, is you know, it captures the general sense of the legacy pro-Israel approaches. So we'll see what this means in the next elections, assuming we have more elections. But and then there's a bipartisan piece of it, or the cross-partisan piece of it, transpartisan, that word. Because what we're seeing at the same time, we're seeing this evidence of an extraordinary shift in the progressive side of the political spectrum. We're also seeing a shift on the right, which I don't think most of us understand yet. I certainly don't. But it looks like we're seeing what is, and I've talked to friends of mine who work on Christian Zionism who've been saying this is coming for years. You have a generation of young Christians who are conservative but do not see things through this evangelical dispensationalist approach. And it almost feels like we're breaking down on the conservative side between someone who gets up and first declares I'm a Christian, by which they mean evangelical dispensationalist. So it's, you know, Israel's at the top of my agenda, to I'm a Christian, meaning sort of MAGA, and how dare you put Israel's interests and give money to Israel when Americans need it. Just fascinating political trends. As a political scientist, these are interesting times.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk Mamdani all day. It's such in my view, a wonderful, hopeful moment in this era of authoritarianism. The way that, you know, he started his campaign, he had 1% support. Most people didn't even know who he was, and he ends up winning the mayoral race in New York against not just opposition from, you know, the establishment in the Democratic Party, but the president, the Congress, and then the vitriol that was directed against him and the money that was thrown to defeat him. It's sort of one, you know, have something to be hopeful about when you wake up in the morning.
And let's be clear. I mean, there are other candidates out there who are, you know, there are other people who got elected during this last round who are openly concerned with Palestinian lives and rights, which is they still got elected. I will say that, you know, I don't know. The politics are different everywhere. Politics are so local in this country. So I think, you know, people are trying to hope to replicate this exactly. And Mamdani is, you know, such an extraordinary candidate in terms of charisma and talent. But there are changes afoot, and it's very encouraging for a lot of us. I think it's very, very worrying for much of the political status quo, including people like Hillary Clinton, who would say the problem is that we're not educating our kids right.
And TikTok is the problem. So we're talking about Mamdani on Thursday, so we can open the floor to other people and other topics if you want for that.
Yeah, sure. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the shifts happening on the right, right?
Yeah.
Because some of this is coming out of places that I view as quite anti-Semitic, right? And I also wonder how organizations like the ADL, like how they're, like, I see a real threat in terms of anti-Semitism right now.
Yeah.
Like a real threat of the growth of anti-Semitism in this country because of both who has suddenly become my bedfellow, right, as someone who cares about Palestinian rights,
Mhm.
but also because of this administration that we have, where like outright, you know,
Mhm.
neo-Nazi positions are okay. So so on the one hand, there's like a little bit of hope about that shift, but I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, I'm sure we all understand that it's a mixed bag, but I'm just trying to grapple with that. And then I wonder why these institutions, and I know they're problematic institutions like the ADL, have been concerned, at least in name, with anti-Semitism, are not concerned about these kind of alliances.
Yeah, I mean, these are, yeah. So there's a trying to navigate the right now, what's happening is very complex. It's complex, and I think it's fraught. I mean, I follow lots of people, or I see lots of people on social media that I would never repost or share. And I'm still fascinated by what they're posting. But, you know, I watch the full video and I'm like, I'm pretty sure there's some really, yeah, I mean, there's some very anti-Semitic people out there who, for their own reasons, have come to places where on this issue, I'm like, yeah, you're actually making sense, but ooh, it's still steeped with some pretty icky stuff. That's going to be really hard for everyone to navigate, and I'm very worried for Palestinian activists. This is being set up as a trap, frankly, not deliberately as a trap, but it is. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot and trying to figure out how to get out in front of a little bit, because I said to a friend of mine today, you know, if this was, 1930s, Holocaust against my people, I think it's a really heavy thing to ask me to say, well, I'm not going to be happy that this person's standing up for me and saying Nazis are bad and shouldn't be killing Jews just because they're also terrible people. I don't think it's fair to ask people to navigate that. And I think that's what's going to happen. I think it's very, very likely. At the same time, there are, I think, some very encouraging trends in terms of a generation, and this is, I think, cross-partisan, setting aside the far right kind of the debates we're having around heritage and Tucker and Fuentes and all that. I think if you listen, if you watch, social media, a generation which says, you can say whatever you want. I've been watching the videos of Israeli soldiers committing war crimes and laughing about it. Don't tell me that this isn't happening. And it's a generation that across the political spectrum, wherever they come down, that there's a sense of these things are interlinked. There's a reason why, people are saying free Palestine. I keep forgetting the name of this young country artist who I found on TikTok, his song went to the top of new artists on iTunes. And he mentions a whole list of things that are wrong in the world. And I mean, I don't know what his political views are, but one of them was kids starving in Gaza. Just threw that out. I was watching a video of a fabulous, really fascinating American, I don't know where he's from, Kentucky or something, Latino gay rapper who you kids probably know about, but I just discovered. And he's in the middle of one of these songs, he's like, free Palestine, say it again, free Palestine. There's an intersectionality. People hate that word so much on the left and the right, the mainstream, or the sort of whatever, the old school. It's intersectional. It's people realizing all of our faiths are connected, all these issues are connected, and trying to tell them otherwise isn't going to convince them, which is good.
John?
Thank you so much for being here. I am a grad student in the Master's in Democracy and Governance program, also a Jewish student, and I'm curious for your identity and the work that you do. I think there's this contention between Jews being perceived as the most credible arbiters on this question of anti-Semitism and Gaza and Palestine solidarity. And in my view, sometimes that being very useful as a kind of strategic tokenization kind of approach in order to shift the conversation. On the other hand, I have heard from a lot of Palestinian activists that this is reinforcing the credibility solely being in the hands of this religious ethnic group, and that why shouldn't Palestinians and everyone be able to debate this question and not have all the credibility just be in the hands of Jews. And so I'm wondering how you kind of navigate that question of your position, how much you try to show up very presently as a Jew versus like step back and have everybody involved in this conversation. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. Like many of the questions here, there's not going to be a single answer that will please everybody. I will say that irrespective of what anybody else thinks, I feel like I have an obligation to step up and, throw myself in front of this where I can.
Mhm.
I feel that obligation as an American, as a white American, as a middle-aged American woman, and as a Jew. I mean, absolutely, I feel like I have that obligation. I feel there's privilege that it is my duty to exploit that privilege. I also feel that part of having that privilege is, is lending that privilege to others, right? So, I'm to the extent that my organization platforms people, we have worked very, very hard to platform Palestinian voices. I will say, for the course of my career, I took up a lot of space on a lot of panels that didn't have enough Palestinians or any Palestinians. I feel remorse for that. I think remorse isn't worth crap. But what I can do is I can make sure that everything I do now is focused on making sure that Palestinian voices are at the forefront. If anybody had the watch, I did a long podcast a couple weeks ago with Quincy, and when they invited me, I said, "Don't you want a Palestinian?" They said, "We promise we have Palestinians. We really want you." I said, "Really?" So that my first question when I'm asked, and we had this conversation about this series, is, what about Palestinian voices? That's more important. And it ended that podcast by making the pitch for people to listen to Palestinians, not to me. I think you just got to do our best to navigate this with humility and compassion and listen to the people that we're trying to be allies to, because they will let us know, what they need, what they want us to do.
Sir?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this discussion. I'm really glad you came here. I would like to make a distinction, if I can, between people who are Jewish and Judaism, the religion, and if that's acceptable. I don't mean this to be silly, but it might be a little academic. I studied a year in Hebrew in seminary, and I've been to Israel, Palestine 6 times. First time in 1988, the last time in May of 2024. At which time, Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims, and I think with a little bit of echo of Jewish forces in Israel, were saying that the genocide was destroying the religion and the country. So my question is, given what Netanyahu and Smallbridge and the IDF and so forth has done, understanding Judaism to be a much more pro-human rights and built in from the experiences in what we call here the Old Testament, isn't Netanyahu one of the biggest anti-Semites?
I'm gonna. There's a lot of. I can see it'd be very satisfying to say that. Maybe I don't know. I mean, religion. I'm speaking here is not. I do not have a PhD in comparative religions. I will say that I live in a world where I had listened for the past how many days to a bunch of people in Congress who claim to be Christians explain why it's okay to starve the poor, right? I mean, these are the Christians, capital C.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the whole idea of like religion existing, there are people who interpret it in different ways. I spent a lot of time in the West Bank with settlers who will explain to you why Judaism, why what they're living and doing is the true embodiment of Judaism.
Right.
That the Judaism that I learned as a Jewish American from a progressive family has nothing to do with actual Torah Judaism, and that I have been taught a completely bastardized form of Judaism that is, it has nothing to do with the true religion. I don't think you're going to solve that for different people. What I will say, I mean, anti-Semite, I mean, it's not the word I'd use here. I would say in terms of if Israel was in the minds of certainly most Jewish Americans, or certainly my grandparents' generation, was necessary to assure the safety of the Jewish people, I would say if we're looking for who is doing more to undermine the safety of the Jewish people worldwide, it is the government of Israel, right? I mean, and when you have, the groups in the United States that are supposed to be fighting and defending Jewish safety, Jewish security, have essentially, we hinted at this before, have essentially dropped the ball on that. Why is it that, we didn't have a Trump monitor, but we have a Mamdani monitor? I mean, we never had a monitor for any of these people who are, I never felt really concerned about the surge, the idea of the surge in anti-Semitism in this country until the first Trump campaign, when I started getting the most vicious anti-Semitic stuff on social media. I was on a dating app at the time, and the morning after Trump was elected the first time, I took everything off that dating app that indicated that I was Jewish because I didn't feel safe having that out there out front. For the first time in my life, it didn't feel safe. But for some reason, the organizations that are supposed to care about Jewish safety are more concerned with promoting the government of Israel.
Mhm.
I think that is the real problem, and that's not about being anti-Semitic or whatever. I mean, it's about what is your conception of what is good for the Jews? If what you think is good for the Jews means for permanent Israeli impunity as a garrison state that is permitted and defended in committing crimes against the Palestinians and eroding any sense of international law or accountability around the world, because that's where we are now,
Mhm.
right? If in order to allow Israel to do what it's doing in Gaza, we have to take down the entire international legal system, any concepts of rules of war, that's what we're going to do. How is that good? How is that good? It's not good for humanity. It's certainly not good for the Jews. That's what my grandmother would have said. It's not good for the Jews.
We're gonna take one more question from the audience, one more online, and then we're gonna end it. Go ahead. Yep. Yep.
Thank you. Hi, Nada, you've heard me say this before, but I want to talk about, like George Lakoff talks about framing, and whoever sets the terms of the debate, of the language,
Mhm.
sets the frames of the debate, and then when you use their language, you reinforce
Right.
their message against you.
Mhm.
And another term he uses, hypocognition, which means low thinking,
Mhm.
where like you don't have the language or categories of thinking. So there's one word that means completely different phenomenon, including anti-Semitism, including, anyway, so I just want to, so one thing, let's talk about whether Israel has the right to exist. Someone, I wish I knew who said this, do they have the right to dominate? The other thing that what's going on now is not anti-Semitism. It's a completely different phenomenon than anti-Semitism. And I think it's horror, backlash from genocide, or I think words like, I was thinking Judeophobia or Zionophobia
Mhm.
or something. And also like Islamophobia is fear. Anti-Semitism is about hate. And I think there's fear, that there's also hate. And like from the river to the sea, there, like I said, these tropes that aren't challenged, and there are things that you can do to like puncture them and make them unusable again. So like from the river to the sea, you can say like only peace will make us free, or from the river to the sea, human rights are guaranteed.
Mhm.
Something to replace it and not to allow it to be used.
Sounds like a comment more than a
Yeah.
question. Do you want to comment on that? Yeah.
A couple of things. I'll say I will never tell Palestinians how to protest. I feel like as part of, for the years I spent in the Jewish progressive spaces, we spent a lot of time telling Palestinians, if you just talk this way, if you just do it this way, we'll have success. And they did it. It didn't matter. I don't think there's a way of getting this right, because you're not dealing with good actors on the other side. And I'm not ever gonna be part of that. But I will say, there is anti-Semitism out there.
But it's different. It's different.
But I want to be really, really clear. And I say this as someone who spends a lot of time in right-wing social media and listservs. There's horrendous anti-Semitism out there. And the fact that some of those people are also saying, what's happening in Gaza is unacceptable. I'm so happy they're speaking up, and that whatever people pay attention to them, or listening to them as they say, what's happening in Gaza is terrible. But what the next sentence, if you listen to the rest of the video is about these horrible Jews and Jews, it's just a horrendous stuff. And I think it's important to not like kid ourselves. But that is just one piece of it. And we were talking before about the Mamdani piece of this. I think we do have a backlash. It's a shame that it took a genocide. And it's a shame, that it took, live stream 2 years of just the most horrific, we'll say, actual war crimes or indignities. I said to someone I know well, who's very pro-Israel, very early on in this, there's no way that Israel is going to be able to come back from some of this, because this isn't about a debate about like Hollywood. We're watching videos that the soldiers are putting online of what they're doing while they are laughing about it. There's no way to put this away. This is going to change how the generation that sees these videos sees Israel. And what I didn't say, and the corollary, which is clear to me now, is it's also going to change how a lot of them see, if they are Jewish, it's how they see their parents and the organizational leadership that stands up for this, that either pretends it isn't happening or defends it. And for people who aren't Jewish, when they've got Jewish organizational leaders insisting that there's no distinction between Israel and Jews, it's going to change how they feel about Jews unless Jews are speaking up and saying, no, that's wrong. And I think that's why some of us feel, irrespective of anything going on in Palestine movement, for the sake of Jewish movement, for the sake of Jewish identity, it is critical to stand up. Because our leaders are saying, no, we're okay with this as a community. And if you disagree, we're going to fight you and try to ruin you. And by the way, we're going to still insist that anyone who discredits us, it's not because of what Israel's doing, it's because they're anti-Semites. If we don't stand up to that, then for our own safety and our own identity, we are failing.
Last question from online. You've sort of answered this, but I'll give you one last opportunity. The questioner asks, how does the weaponization of anti-Semitism hurt American Jews?
I feel like, so I feel like I kind of just did that.
Yes.
Look, fundamentally, it is, I have for years, since before October 7th, bemoaned the way that Jewish legacy organizations have prioritized defending Israel over defending Jewish identity, Jewish life in this country. I think it was a terrible mistake. That was before October 7th. I think where things are today and where it is today, what they have essentially created is a paradigm in which they are telling the world that they have a choice, which is stand with Judaism, which is defined by support for genocide, or be at war with Jews as a minority, as a people that have been faced with anti-Semitism. I think it's disastrous. And more than anything else, it undermines the ability to fight actual anti-Semitism. If you're going to call everything anti-Semitism, that's hard enough. And that's always been an issue. If everything's anti-Semitism, nothing's anti-Semitism, right? But if you're calling everything anti-Semitism at a time when we're literally looking at videos of genocide, today we're looking at videos of the aftermath in Gaza of just, scorched earth. And you say, this was not self-defense. They call you, you're an anti-Semite. You said it's not self-defense to raise every building in Gaza City. I mean, this is not how you fight anti-Semitism. Fighting anti-Semitism is not possible. Fighting actual anti-Semitism is not possible if you have prioritized defending Israel above it, and if you have so utterly, what's the word I'm looking for? If you've so utterly erased the meaning of the word that you can't even have a good discussion about what it is.
Laura, this has been a very educational exercise. I want to thank you for being here. Let me just end on a positive note. Everyone's excited about Zohran Mamdani and the results from New York. 33% of Jews in New York voted for Mamdani. That number goes up to, I think, close to 70% if you look at younger American Jews. They saw through the campaign, the attempt to weaponize it. And so that gives us sort of some hope for where sort of things can move in this country with respect to this important topic. So thanks for being here. Please join me in thanking Lara Friedman.